Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Real Estate Show. I'm Tiffany Weber, as you know, and we are doing a series at the beginning of this year called Back to Basics. So it is our goal to make sure listing agents, buyer's agents feel extremely comfortable with the main documents you're going to see on every closing, and that you can do this exceptionally well when it comes to explaining it to your clients. So today we are talking about the buyer's side of things. So if you represent buyers, grab your coffee, get comfy, and let's get into it. So today I've got a buyer's closing disclosure that we're going to go over in detail. And I am also doing a video if you're listening to this audio only. So maybe bookmark this to come back and watch the video if you want to see the physical documents, or, like if you're sitting somewhere with your headphones in, but you've got a closing disclosure or Alta settlement statement handy, you can follow along with that. Even if you're not looking at the document, I do think you'll get a lot of good information out of this. But if you hear me refer to the document, just know that in the video version, you can see it. So the buyer's closing disclosure, let's start at the top with the basics. These things are self-explanatory, really, because it tells you the date issued. So when did this closing disclosure get made? That's going to be helpful because you'll know if you're looking at the most recent version. If you've got two different versions in front of you, and one was issued on January 2nd, 2024, and another was issued on January 8th, 2024, then you're probably going to need to rely on the most recent one. Or if you're not sure which one is correct, you can reach out and say, which one of these is right? The one issued on the 2nd or the one issued on the 8th? This is also going to tell you the difference in the closing date and the disbursement date. Closing date referring to the day that the documents are being signed, and disbursement date referring to the date that the money is being dispersed. So the intended disbursement date, of course, could change based on if the documents are unable to be recorded. Documents potentially could be unable to be recorded because not everything was signed in time, not all the money got in, etc. In which case the documents would have to be recorded on a different date. The parties could agree to keep the disbursement date and the prorations the same, but again, no money is changing hands until, in North Carolina at least, the documents have been recorded. You're going to see here who is acting as settlement agent. This is a real file that we had. I've redacted the information that would identify the property and the parties, but we were the settlement agent. That's also had our file number listed here, the property address, and the sale price. You could probably do the math on this one. The sale price on this one was just over $1 million. Transaction information, buyer, seller, lender identified, as well as how long of a loan term there is, if the loan has a fixed rate or if it is adjustable, and then the type of loan. So the pre-printed versions are conventional FHA, VA, and there's also a check for other types. And then if the lender has your loan ID, which they're going to have a loan number, that'll be listed here. So important things on page 1. This is the summary. This is the highlight, and it can give you almost every important piece of information you need to know about the numbers right here. You take all of this information, you can drill down into it more on the later pages to get the detail. But if you want someone who needs the highlights, or is really just wanting to make sure that the main terms of the loan are captured, you can look at page 1 and see just about everything you need to know for that. Under loan terms, you'll see your loan amount. And then there's a handy thing here that says, can this amount increase after closing? And in loans like this, the answer is no, but it'll be spelled out clearly that no, this loan amount cannot increase after closing. The interest rate, this is a fixed rate loan, so the interest rate cannot increase after closing. And then you'll see your monthly principal and interest payment. Now, if you have an escrow account, this is not your monthly payment. This is not your total monthly payment. It is specifically your monthly principal and interest payment. Now, because the loan amount cannot change and the interest rate cannot change, the principal and interest cannot change either. So since those two things are the same, or have to remain the same, then so will the monthly principal and interest. Is there a prepayment penalty? No. Is there a balloon payment? No. Of course, if either of those things were yes, then this would be listed as yes, and then the terms of the balloon payment or the prepayment penalty would be listed in the loan documents. Now, projected payments here. And the reason why this particular thing says projected payments is because this buyer has an escrow account, and escrows are estimates based on the information that is available at the time. Escrows include numbers that can change, like taxes and insurance. So here, what you'll see, payment calculation will include your principal and interest. If the buyer has PMI on their loan, that will be listed here as well and will be factored into the payment. And then your estimated escrows are included here. So as I mentioned, that amount can change. So that's why it's listed here. Amount can increase over time, and that is based on what insurance companies are charging you for your insurance or what your taxes are for the property. So that's why here it says your estimated total monthly payment, which will include everything that was added up above. Now, underneath this, it's showing you some things that you might be responsible to pay monthly that are not principal and interest. So in this case, there are taxes and insurance, which are already included in the monthly payment. So you'll see that in escrow ? It'll say yes and yes for those two. And then this property also has homeowners association dues. So those are, kind of estimated a month to be, since in this case, the taxes and insurance were estimated right at $510, and then the total monthly estimate was $526. Then here you're estimated about $16 a month for HOA dues. And you'll see that that is not in escrow. And then there's a note here to see escrow account on page 4 for details. You must pay for other property costs separately. On page 4, we'll get to that. There's a chart showing the estimated escrowed costs for year 1. If you owe something on the property that's not escrowed, that is something the buyer has to write a check for when that bill comes due. So down at the bottom, you've got your closing costs. Those will be itemized on the following pages individually. And then you have your cash to close, which is the bottom line. That's what the buyer needs to bring to closing to be able to close. Sometimes people think that the cash to close is in addition to the closing costs. That's not correct. It is inclusive of the closing costs. So that $8102.22 is part of the $204,794. If you are listening only, I'm referring to in this particular example, the exact numbers that are written on the page I'm looking at. Now, on page 2 of the buyer's closing disclosure, this is where the breakdown of the closing costs occurs. Now, page 1 shows you the total closing costs. Page 2 has a little more detail in that it tells you exactly what those closing costs are and whether they were paid for before closing or will be paid at closing as part of that cash to close. So section A of page 2 of the closing disclosure has your loan origination charges. This particular borrower worked with Movement Mortgage and they were charged an application fee here in this section. Section B, the buyer paid for their appraisal ahead of time. So it is being accounted for here as a cost of closing, but it is offset in the before closing column. And then in the rest of that, services borrower did not shop for, meaning the vendor was chosen by the lender and is required to get the loan. That's got the remaining charges, so credit reports, finding out if you're in a flood zone, getting copies of the borrower's tax transcripts. Section C, services borrowed did shop for. These are things that are required to close, but the buyer has some discretion in who they work with. So these are things like, in this particular case, the buyer had a legal services plan so that they didn't have to pay the attorney fee directly. Their legal insurance would reimburse the attorney. So you won't see that on here, but this is where the attorney would go. So since that is something that's chosen by the buyer. Lender's title insurance, that you don't have to pick any particular title insurance company. So you can choose the title insurance company. Most often the borrowers just allow the closing attorney to obtain the title insurance for them. Since the attorneys don't make any money off the title insurance, there's really no incentive to go one way or the other. Section D is a subtotal of everything in A, B, and C. So you'll see anything paid at closing and before closing subtotaled into the loan costs there. Now, in other costs, this is everything else. Section E of that closing costs page 2 is going to have the recording fees. So because this buyer had a deed to be recorded, which they pay for under the contract, and they had a deed of trust, this is what the state charges for those recording fees to actually index the documents. Section F shows you everything that the buyer had to prepay as part of this closing. One being the insurance. Lender wants to see that the insurance is in place and effective as of the date of closing. So out of this closing and the closing costs, the buyer pays for that insurance up front. Same thing on the interest. The first loan payment is typically, like today is January 5th. So if you were to close today, your first payment would not be due February 1st, it would be due March 1st. So because interest is calculated in arrears, then you are prepaying your interest for the rest of the month. So someone that's closing in my office today will see here prepaid interest at whatever that rate is per day from 1/5/24 to the end of the month. So that would be something they have to pay since they're not making a February payment. And then Section G is establishing the initial escrow account. So the escrow account, I've talked in other videos about how it is essentially the forced savings account for taxes and insurance or anything else that's escrowed so that the lender can oversee that process of making sure those obligations are paid. The escrowed things are things that could affect the lender's security interest. Insurance, if you don't have insurance in effect on the property, and something devastating happens to the property, then the lender's security interest has been severely diminished in value. Taxes, if you don't pay your taxes, then there can be a tax lien and the tax authority can foreclose, and that can affect the lender's security interest. So this is why the lender wants an escrow account. But that escrow account always needs a cushion, and that is in case those obligations increase. If taxes go up, if insurance goes up, the lender will have enough in there to make those payments and then settle up with you after. But there are regulations that don't allow lenders to keep more than a certain amount. It depends on the borrower, your loan cost, etc. So there's not a specific dollar amount that it is. It's different for every borrower. But lenders can't keep more than they're allowed to keep. So there is this line item here called aggregate adjustment, and you'll see it as a negative number. And that is offsetting what they took to put in your escrow account by what they're allowed to keep. So that is an adjustment, just making sure that they're complying with the laws applicable to them and to escrow accounts. That I get a question about that a lot. Is like, what is this adjustment? Are we getting a credit? Why are we getting a credit? It is a credit, but it's more so because there's only so much money that can be kept in the escrow account. Now, Section H of this will include really any other things that need to be paid. So some agents, their brokerages require their buyers to pay an administrative fee, so that could be here. Even though the sellers are paying the commission, the buyer may have an admin fee to be remitted. They pay for their owner's title insurance policy. Let's say they engage the attorney to do something outside of just the settlement. Say they needed to be prepared a power of attorney or some other document, an easement agreement, that could fall under Section H. If they have invoices they need to pay, say they got a survey and they did not prepay for that, they'll pay for the survey on the closing statement. So Section H is somewhat of a catch-all of other things that need to be paid that don't fit in one of these predefined sections, and the lender allows to be paid on the closing statement. So Section I of this page totals E, F, G, and H, and then Section J totals everything above it. Now, the next page, page 3 of the closing disclosure, there is a chart at the top it's fairly self-explanatory, but it can sometimes be confusing for buyers because they want to know, why did the cash to close change so much? And it's because they're not realizing that it's a comparison of the loan estimate and the final closing disclosure. So the loan estimate is provided to the borrower at the beginning of the loan process, and it is just that, it is an estimate. It is before the buyer has engaged any of their service providers. It's before title insurance has been procured, before homeowners insurance has been procured, before anything that needs to be paid for has been decided. So it is very difficult to get that loan estimate to the penny. It is most often wildly different than your final closing disclosure. Occasionally I'll see it really close, but again, that's dependent upon the choices the buyer makes in certain service providers. The lenders know their service providers, so they can estimate their portion, but it's going to be difficult for them to estimate exactly what the buyer's final number will be at the beginning when the buyer hasn't made those choices on what providers they're going to use. So that estimate or that comparison is just showing you, hey, this is what we thought at the beginning, kind of roundabout figures, and then this is what everything came out to be. And there's some notes in here as why. For example, the loan estimate had estimated some seller credits. Those didn't come out to be. It was negotiated down to a lesser amount. So you're going to see, okay, well, that changed because it negotiated. Or the closing costs paid before closing, the final number. You paid these closing costs before closing, so of course that's going to change. If you've got closing costs, like they know you have to pay an appraisal, but they don't know if you're going to pay it beforehand or not. It just depends on the lender. Then it's going to affect that estimate compared to the final. So usually not a ton of time is spent on that at the closing table because, again, it's just a comparison. The number that matters is your final. Now, on the summaries of transactions, in my experience, the lenders really only focus on the accuracy of the buyer's side because that's their client and that's what has to be correct. The seller's transaction side is often not fully updated to reflect the seller's transaction. You would look to the Alta settlement statement if you wanted more detail on the seller's transaction. So for that reason, I'm going to focus on the borrower's transaction side of this page, just so that you can explain that to your client. Now, Section K of this is what the buyer owes. So they're going to owe the sale price, which is what they're paying for the property. They're going to owe their closing costs paid at closing. So in this specific example, you're going to notice the closing costs paid at closing is less than what was on page 1, the closing costs. Why is that? Pop quiz. Because the buyer paid for their appraisal ahead of time. So what closing costs paid at closing results comes from the closing costs minus anything paid in advance. What's left over is what they have to pay at the closing table as part of that cash to close. Next, the buyer owes their HOA dues from the date of closing through the end of that period that the seller had prepaid. And then Section L of this summary of transaction is what the buyer has already paid, borrowed, or gotten credit for. So in this particular one, you've got deposit, which is referring to the earnest money deposit. That's being accounted for. Next, the loan is being applied to what the buyer owes, as is the seller credit and the due diligence fee that the buyer paid for in advance. And then here you're going to see a section in here for items unpaid by seller. In this case, when this particular property closed in January 2023, tax bills for the property were not out yet. So the buyer is going to have to pay for that in full when the bill comes out. So they're receiving a credit from the seller for the seller's portion of the 2023 taxes. So down at the bottom, the calculation will show you what's due from the borrower. What does the borrower owe? So a tally of everything in Section K. And then what is the borrower borrowing, getting credit for, has already paid, etc. So total paid already by or on behalf of borrower at closing, which is tally of everything in Section L. So those credits and debits result in that cash to close. So if you've got someone who sees that cash to close and they're like, where did that number come from? This is where. So you can direct them to that page 3. All right, now page 4 here of the closing disclosure, I like to call this in closing the Cliff's Notes of the loan documents. So it's going to give you some information about the terms of the loan. It's going to let you know, can the loan be assumed? This particular loan cannot be assumed on the original terms. Does the loan have a demand feature, which would let the lender require early repayment? This loan does not. Is there a late payment fee? I have yet to see one that didn't have a late payment fee, but I guess it's possible that the answer could be no. But in this particular case, yes, there is a late payment fee. It's giving you a summary of how late is late and what is the late fee charge. Whether you have a negative amortization feature, meaning do you have any monthly payments that are not going to cover the interest that month? Whether your lender will accept partial payments, and if so, do they apply them right away or do they hold them in account until you get the full amount? There's a list here of what property you're granting a security interest in. That's, marked out here so it doesn't identify. And it says here, you may lose this property if you do not make your payments or satisfy other obligations for this loan. That is a very simple explanation of everything that's going to be outlined in the borrower's deed of trust. I mentioned earlier there's going to be a chart about your escrow account. So this is showing you estimated escrowed property costs over year 1. So this particular borrower has estimated property costs in escrow of just over $6,000. So that's taxes and insurance. And then non-escrowed property costs over year 1 estimated at $200. So that was the estimate for the homeowners association dues for the year. And then breaking down how much cushion was put into the escrow account and the monthly escrow portion of the payment. If the lender doesn't have an escrow account or isn't requiring an escrow account, that will be noted here as well. All right, now page 5 of the closing disclosure, there's a chart in the upper left corner, and I mentioned this in closing. Everybody hates this chart because it shows how much interest you will pay over the life of the loan, meaning the borrower will pay over the life of the loan if they don't make any extra payments. So it's showing you, in this case, it's a 30-year loan, fixed rate. If this person never refinances or pays extra money, they're going to pay in this case, $1.8 million and change for the property over 30 years. And it shows you how much of that is in interest, which was almost $990,000, and how much was in principal, including how much interest you'll pay over the loan term expressed as a percentage of your loan amount. So in this case, the person will pay 118% of the loan amount as interest. And then other disclosures, whether you had an appraisal, whether your state law may protect you, offer foreclosure protectors, may offer foreclosure protection. Gosh, I cannot say those two words together. And then also how you get in contact with your lender, both agents and the settlement agent. And then you sign confirming receipt and that you believe that this to be accurate statement of the charges. And there's also a disclosure here that just because you sign the closing disclosure or, say you received a copy of the form, that doesn't mean you're accepting the loan. You're not accepting the loan or moving forward with the closing unless you've signed the note and the deed of trust. So that's just a disclosure here that you're just saying, I got the form, I've looked at it. But that's not the end of the process until the note and deed of trust have been signed and the deed and deed of trust have been recorded. So that is the buyer's closing disclosure. For buyers, that is going to be the number one thing that they're going to want to go over. It's got a lot of information, important information. But the combined settlement statement, the ALTA combined settlement statement, ALTA referring to American Land Title Association that came up with this form, will have just the numbers, not the detail, not the explanations of things, on the right side of the combined settlement statement in the credit and debits column. So this happens to be the same closing. So we're looking at the same ALTA settlement statement as the closing disclosure. So you can see here how the information is the same, just presented slightly differently. You'll see here in the buyer debit column the sale price of the property. And then next, the buyer is getting credit for a couple things, one being their earnest money deposit, the loan that's being applied, the seller credit that was negotiated, and then underneath that, they're getting credit for what the seller owes in 2023 taxes. Again, since the buyer was responsible to pay the 2023 taxes when that bill was released. Buyer paid a due diligence fee, that's being credited to what they owe as well. Now, the buyer owes the seller for some stuff as well. We already talked about the fact that the HOA dues through June 30th, the buyer's responsible from the date of closing to what was prepaid, so they're giving the seller that credit. Under loan charges, these are the things that we saw on page 2 of the closing disclosure. Any origination or application fees. You'll see that the appraisal fee, $750 POC by borrower, POC referring to paid outside of closing. So you'll see that it was charged. It's just not being charged today because it was already paid. Credit reports, flood cert, those things that I mentioned to you earlier. Now, impounds is another way to say escrow. So that's going to be, I believe it's section G in the closing disclosure. Yeah, initial escrow payment at closing. Same information is there. So your homeowner's insurance and taxes, and then the aggregate adjustment. So adjusting what the lender is allowed to keep. The next thing for the buyer here, the debit, was the recording fees for the deed and deed of trust. That was seen on the closing disclosure as well. Now moving on to the second page, you've seen the lender's title policy and owner's title policy already. They were just in different sections on the CD, the closing disclosure, because that's the form that the lender required. But here, all the title charges are combined. This is also where you'd see the attorney's fee if this particular buyer had to come out of pocket for it, which they didn't due to a legal plan that paid that for them. So your lender's title insurance, the owner's title insurance, and then lastly, that homeowner's insurance premium payable to whoever that insurance company is, which here it's been obscured. So the subtotals under buyer, the main number you want to look at is that due from buyer number. And I like to, in closing, make my clients cross-reference the due from buyer number with the cash to close and make sure that they are exactly the same. In this case, they are right to the penny because that is the amount that the borrower needed to bring to closing. And then once they've done that, we'll move on to the signature addendum, which is saying, I have reviewed the settlement statement. I believe it to be true and accurate, and I allow the closing attorney or the settlement agent to disperse the funds in accordance with that statement. So I know that is a lot of information. I know that the documents are lengthy, but this will be a part of every closing you do. So it's important that you feel extremely comfortable with these documents, like to a point where you could talk about it in your sleep if you had to, so that your clients feel comfortable and confident at the closing table that you can get ahead of anything that could potentially be an error. Maybe you've missed submitting an invoice, whatever it may be, getting ahead of those things so that your client is comfortable at the table and we don't have unnecessary delays. So I know it was basic, but like I said, we are getting back to basics at the beginning of 2024. So hopefully you got some good information from this one, and we'll catch you in the next episode.